said full production. God. I'm being stupid. Test, test.
because we've got so much. Oh, that's a little loud. Yeah. I did find out this morning that of all the videos that have ever been put up in any form by Grace Church, of the top 5 watched ones, I'm the top 4. Oh yeah, one is a funeral. It was the two boys that were killed in the airplane crash. Almost 700,000 people have watched that funeral. The next 2 are one on Hagar and Sarah, and the other on the 400 years of slavery of the Jews, and they're watched almost exclusively by Muslims who want to kill me. Yeah. And the other one is parenting adult children. And 38,000 people have watched that sermon. And that's the 4th one of the... And most of the people who comment think I'm out of my mind. Because I said that, and it's mostly about the fact that I said that we need to, as adults, with our adult children, have boundaries that give them the freedom to be the parents that they want to be. I said something like that. I don't know. And I told them this morning when they were telling me about that I will respond to all these knuckleheads after I leave Grace Church on the staff, because I've got about 4 words I'll use, and they'll all just be like, or let me talk to your kids. Anyway, that's just interesting. It's just, oh no, I'm never, I'm Tim Ayers and I live at 14444. No, I don't ever even look at them. They were just telling me about it. Mighty, who used to be the video guy here, though, when I was doing the short videos, during the COVID, remember I do those half-hour ones? Probably nobody watched them, but Mighty and I it's like this. There's a camera. I'm in the room by myself. He's behind the camera with his phone. And then when I'd spoken for 20 minutes, he'd go like this. Meaning I'd gone 20 minutes and I had to knock it off within 10. And as soon as I'd finish, half the time he'd go, boy, those Muslims hate you. You've gotten 4,000 more views, and every comment is people hating you that you don't know what you're talking about. Oh, yes. So there. Anyway. Or I would finish, and I got pretty worked up sometimes on those half-hour things. And he'd go, hey, Tim, can I transplant arborvitae at this time of the year? Because, I used to be a landscaper. Thanks, Mighty. I love him. But it was very clear to me that he was just doing his job. Anyway.
Was that on Grace website, all this?
Yeah, I honestly... Pardon?
I didn't know you could comment.
Oh, no, this is on YouTube. It's just people who watch on YouTube. Yeah, no. I don't know who those people are. I don't care. No, if I paid attention to what people say to me on the things that I preach on the weekends from people from who knows where, I'd be a nervous wreck. I've had somebody out to kill me, and it was real, and he was going to kill me. And the police had to come and take him out of his house and take him home, or take him to a facility. So I know what it is to actually have somebody want to kill you. And be telling you he's going to kill you at this time, on this day, in that parking lot, and it was really awful. It was a month of hell, is what it was. But at least I wasn't getting comments from him on a YouTube thing too. He had to actually speak to me face to face. He was speaking to me though.
And he lived in Indianapolis?
Oh yeah, he started coming. He went to some little church. Why am I talking about this? He went to some little church, little highly Pentecostal church, and they told him that if he took his meds, he wouldn't be able to hear from God. And they were right. He went off his meds and he heard from God. And what God told him was that he was to pull into this church, and whoever was in the pulpit, he was to kill. And he was getting these messages that were all numbers. And he would show them to me and say, this says this and this and this and this. And I said, I can't figure out the messages that you're getting. This has gone on. And he was saying, he was two people. One person was a person who's going to kill me, and then the other was a person who was going to save me when the other person was going to kill him. And I said to him one time, I said, can I just have one of those messages so I can look at it a little longer? I was really scared. And he gave it to me, and I'll be darned if it wasn't on the back of his next appointment with a psychiatrist. And I knew her. She was the wife of a drummer that's a studio drummer here in town. And I called her and I said, look, the date had passed. It was an appointment that he had apparently, I wanted to know if he went. And she goes, no, we've been trying to find him. You call the police right now. He's going to kill you. He is going to kill you because we know what he's done in the past. And so I called the police. I had to call the police, and they went and got him. I never heard from him again. Anyway, that's been a while. It's probably 12 years ago. Scared me. Scared my wife. He did go in the back in the green room one week and demand to know where I lived from the people in the band, and they didn't know who he was. And somebody came and told me that the dude was in the building during a service and that he was trying to find out where I lived. And I knew he was in the building, and I found him, and it was right out in the lobby there. And I grabbed him by the coat, and I was shaking him, and I swore at him, and I told him in 60 ways what I would do to him if he ever went to my house. Because my wife was there alone at that time. And it's one of those moments when you're sort of having an out-of-body experience. And I probably made it worse. But I just was up in his, you have a whole crowd of people around you, and the pastor's yelling vile things at a person. Praise Jesus, so that kind of. But yeah, I need to write that whole story down because it was a month of crazy. Yeah, crazy. Because I never know which dude was going to show up. There's one guy, but you never knew which dude was going to show up. And he wasn't a big giver, so I didn't care, Anyway, I do have something I need to tell you. Next week, this room is going to be where they have the Good Friday service. Someone near and dear to your heart will be speaking, but they're going to reconfigure this room next week. They're wheeling in pianos and choir thing and all that. And so rather than cancel the class, we're going to do another one of those classes in 111. I know it's not the best thing, but I'd rather we just met than lose a week. Also, some of you may have known that my wife and I last week were going to go visit Jennifer's uncle in Florida right after the day after the class, or Thursday after the class. And this is well known, but my wife's father and brother and uncle were killed in a plane crash when she was 13. And this uncle and aunt moved into her life, and he was as close to a father figure as she had from 13 on. And he was 97, but his mind was absolutely present and clear. And I had just talked to him a week or so before, maybe 10 days before, and he was excited about seeing us. And then on Thursday at 4:20, he died. And so we did not go to Florida to see him, obviously, but the service has been planned, and and they asked me to be a part of the service, which I was very surprised about. But the kids his children, Jennifer's cousins, asked me to be a part of the service, and so I'm not going to be here on the 25th of April. Okay, and I'll tell you more about it. I'll warn you about that. But we have to be in Florida for that. So, yeah, he's one of those guys that didn't meet Jesus till he was either like 83. You know, they lived on Boca Grande. You know the Boca Grande, the little island off of the coast of Florida, and had a little United Methodist church there, and some guy from Taylor got sent there, and he preached the gospel, and the whole place got saved. It's like the church is on fire, and it's cool. So, and every time I'd go down there, they'd have me get up and speak and pray over people, and yeah, because that guy from Taylor was just glad to have somebody from Indiana. So, but anyway, that's where we'll be. All right, I don't think I have any other. That's a lot of talking. I'm sorry. I wasted a lot of your time there. Let's get into this. We are on. We're into verse 56. I need to tell you some things that I didn't tell you last week, but let me pray for us, and I'll just start at 53, even though we've talked about a bunch of that, and we'll go as far as we can. I have enough notes to finish chapter 14, which is the longest chapter. It's 70 verses, guys. My Bible just opens to this page now, so let's pray and we'll get going. Lord, thank you so much for this time. Thank you for the way that you love us and care for us, and thank you for the passages that we're about to read. They are sad in many ways, and that they're so emblematic of your love for us. And so, Father, I pray that we will see your heart and your purposes in the things that we talk about tonight, and that our lives will be drawn closer to you because of the truth that we see in your word. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Alrighty, I'm going to start in 53 just to give us context. Okay, they took Jesus to the high priest's home where the leading priests, elders, and the teachers of the religious law had gathered. Meanwhile, Peter followed him at a distance and went right into the high priest's courtyard. And there he sat with the guards, warming himself by the fire. Inside, the leading priests and the entire high council were trying to find evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. But they couldn't find any. Many false witnesses spoke against him, but they contradicted each other. Finally, some men stood up and gave this false testimony. We heard him say, "I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without human hands." But even they didn't get their story straight. Then the high priest stood up before the others and asked Jesus, "Well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself?" But Jesus was silent, and he made no reply. Then the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand and coming on the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his clothing to show his horror and said, "Why do we need another witness? Why do we need other witnesses? You have all heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" "Guilty," they all cried. "He deserves to die." Then some of them began to spit at him, and they blindfolded him and beat him with their fists. "Prophesy to us," they jeered. And the guards slapped him as they took him away. We talked a great deal about the fact last week about the fact that witnesses had to have an absolute agreement when they gave testimony against someone. I don't know that I mentioned this, but there's no such thing as a prosecutor in trials. In their trials, there's no prosecutor. Witnesses were not asked questions by a prosecutor about things. The witnesses were the prosecutors, and they stood in that circle with the person who was they were witnessing against. And the system was just very different than ours. And they could only go one at a time, as I talked about that before last week. But they had to say exactly the same thing. And they couldn't communicate with each other about things. This is really a strict thing. Many witnesses, it said, and by the way, most of these witnesses would have been paid to do this testimony, to give testimony against Jesus. The way that it could work is that the person would say what they thought was the case, and then the accused would respond and say whether or not they felt that that was true. They didn't put their hand over the Bible and say, they didn't have the Bible to swear on. So, but the whole thing was based around whether or not you could get two people to have identical testimony about what someone did. But Mark he doesn't even try, he just names them, he just calls them false witnesses even before they say anything. And I want to say that there's a really interesting aspect to it. It says in 57, where it says, oh, and by the way, this thing about the witnesses, this is all in the Old Testament. This is not something that was culturally made up. It's in Deuteronomy 19, I think, it's in Deuteronomy 17:6 and then 19:15 and Numbers 35:30. It all says exactly the same thing about two witnesses. And I'm sure I told you last week that if you lied as a false witness, you got the punishment that the other person was supposed to get. And that's from Deuteronomy 19. This is in the notes. I've got all that stuff in the notes. But when it says in 57, it says, finally is not in the Greek, but I don't mind that being there. Finally, some men stood up and gave this false testimony. What they say is, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without human hands. Now, for us, we go, why would anybody get killed for that? Why would anybody bring that accusation and think they could get somebody killed for that? Well, here's the deal. First off, they say that he said, I will destroy. And so it sounds like Jesus has got some kind of plot going on with somebody to come in and tear down the temple. Who built the temple? Herod built the temple. What is Herod? Herod is a client king of the Romans. The Romans allowed Herod to build this temple to quell to make the Jews love the occupation, so that they can pin it on him that he's got some kind of plot going on that they're actually going to Now, they did not have dynamite, and you'd have to come in with sledgehammers. They didn't have bulldozers or anything like that. But just the idea that they were going to physically try to do some damage to this building, tear it down, would have been something that might incite the Romans to stop them. Now, if you look at, particularly in John, where it quotes Jesus saying this, he does not say, I will tear down the temple. He says, bring down this temple. He just says it like that. And 3 days later, I will rebuild it. Now, what they say is that he says, I will destroy the temple made with human hands. Now, on the surface, that sounds fairly harmless. Here's the deal, though. The word that is used for human hands, saying that that it was built with human hands, the word it's chiropoieton, and it means handmade or made by people. Here's the deal. That word was well known from the Septuagint, the Jewish Greek version of the Old Testament. It was the word that was usually used to describe idols. Okay? They would say, these idols are made with human hands and they're worthless. It's a trigger word. There are tons of uses of it in the Septuagint. I think I gave you 6. Or, do not make idols or set up carved images or sacred pillars or sculptured song in the land. I will destroy your pagan shrines and knock down your places of worship. You leave lifeless corpse corpses piled on top of your lifeless idols, and I will despise you. That word in there. And so we will defeat Jerusalem and her gods, just as they destroyed Samaria with hers. The idols will completely disappear. That word that gives us idols is that word that these people use to accuse Jesus. What they're doing is they're inciting them by saying that Jesus said that the temple is the same as an idol. And that's the reason he's going to tear it down. Now, just think about what that would do. Those dudes in the room who are going to make a judgment about Jesus are what? They're leading scribes and elders. They're the religious leaders. They spend their life in the text. And they know that that word is a word that means something that is not of God, something that's been made by men and are worthless and should be destroyed. And they throw that in there. They say, Jesus is saying, I'm going to destroy the temple. Why? Because it's an idol. It's a pagan, false god. And remember, to the Jews, it didn't matter that Herod built it. It still had a sacred space in it where God himself, they were waiting for God himself to come in and live there and be present. That building, the temple, was the center of all sacredness to them. And these false witnesses are going, yeah, he called the temple by a name that says that it's an idol. So they've got him on that. That's what they think they get him on. And then he says, in 3 days I will build another made without human hands. Now the word that gives us without human hands, just to be honest, is found no place, any place else in all of Greek literature anywhere except right here. It is, you've heard me say the phrase hapex legomenon, which speaks of a word that's only used once in the text. Well, this is an uber hapex legomenon. It's not even found anywhere else, any place, in any Greek text, anywhere. And so they know what it means because it's just and some people go, that word's made up. So that Christians must have made it up later so they could blame the Jewish authorities for killing Jesus. They made up a word later and added it to the text because it's not a Greek word, or it's not found anywhere. Does this make sense? My thought is that whoever was testifying against Jesus, and remember, I'll talk about it in a second. They got so flustered that when they got around to accusing Jesus of something, they said that one word, so they made up another word that just sort of sounded like the other one because they're all worked up about it, and so they made it up. And I think that, somebody that's, I know that sounds weird, but it's just, I think that's what happened. Now remember, Mark, when he writes this, there's only 3 places he could get this from. What these people say. He could get it from Nicodemus because Nicodemus is a member of this council. He could get it from John because we know that John was around. He was in the high priest's house somewhere. We don't know where, but he could have heard it. Or he could have heard it from Jesus himself. Peter could have heard it from Jesus himself later on because they talked a great deal. I mean, just think about this. The entire trial can only come from one of those 3 sources because Peter's not able to hear any of this. Nobody else that's connected with them or is in the room. There are now there may have been a couple of other members of that Sanhedrin that became followers of Jesus, but none that we know of by name. And did I say Nicodemus? There's yeah, it's Nicodemus. Yeah, it's Nicodemus. The point is this. That these people were trying to make Jesus out to be what? Somebody who's not only dangerous, but profane. Because if they can make him profane, they can make him a blasphemer and they can kill him for that. And these Jewish leaders they have to find something that they know they can take to the Romans, that if the word gets out that Jesus said this, the people might themselves go after Jesus. And so the Romans need to take care of him to save him from having a riot. Does that make, because the other thing is that if the Romans just take him with no reason, they might have a riot on their hands for that too. So they got to figure out a way to make it so that everybody agrees this guy needs to be killed. This is a really tricky one. Apparently no two people who said this, though, agreed with each other in what they said. And it says, but even they didn't get their stories straight, or that's, they couldn't, well, the truth is he didn't say any of that. And so, like, when you're making up what somebody said, and you can't talk to somebody else about it, and you both have to make it up, you're not going to get it straight. So, anyway, that's just an interesting part of the story, and it usually goes like this. But we could see their purposes there. Now, Jesus was obligated by law to answer any question that the high priest gives him. Do you guys remember the story where Paul is talking to the leaders of the Jewish world, and he says something to the high priest, and somebody slaps him, and they go, don't talk to the high priest that way. And he goes, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were the high priest. I'm so sorry. I would have never said that. I mean, they did hold the high priest in high respect. That's why when we get the next sentence, when it says, then the high priest stood up before the others, this is where he's just done with it. He's just done with it. He's like going to take over. You imagine they've been there for who knows how long, and they keep having witness after witness, and they're not getting them anywhere. And they got to do something about this guy. So he stands up. Now, I have to tell you, there are two schools of thought. It says the high priest stood up before the others. Now, that meant he had to come up and come down. And he asked Jesus, and he's going to talk right straight to him, and Jesus is obligated to respond to him. Nobody else, but this guy he is obligated to. And he says, well, aren't you going to answer these charges? Well, they've been making them, and Jesus has been silent. Have you ever thought about that? It's like he didn't defend himself, he didn't go, no, I never said that. He didn't have to, because they kept contradicting themselves. But it's still interesting to me that he is silent before them. Why? Because he knows where he's going. He knows where he's going, and it's just better for him to accept the cup, as he said it earlier. This would have been very unusual for a person who was being accused falsely to not say anything. The other thing is that the high priest was wanting Jesus to somehow speak in a way that brought guilt on himself. And that was against the law for a person to be pushed into making a statement that convicted them. Again, witnesses were the bottom line. Witnesses. And he didn't, and you can't force somebody to speak in a way. I mean, we kind of have that. You're not allowed to incriminate yourself. Is that what it is? It's sort of like that. But he says, don't you have anything to say for yourself? What do you have to say for yourself? Now, some people think, I have the people and their fuller arguments in the notes, that Caiaphas did not want Jesus to be convicted during Passover, and that what he was trying to do was to get Jesus to talk, because Jesus' talking had been something that had moved the Jewish people. Jesus had been someone whose speaking had been seen as prophetic. And so some people say Caiaphas, he doesn't want anybody like Jesus crucified during Passover week. We don't want that problem. And that he says, please talk, because we don't want to happen what's going to happen. Now, I think that's being really generous towards Caiaphas, to say that his purpose was to get Jesus to talk, and this is a Jewish argument against the reality of this being something that the Jewish leadership caused. They would say that Jesus brought his own death on himself because he wouldn't talk, and that argument is still out there. I'm just going to say I don't think that's the case. I don't think for a minute that Jesus' silence was because he just didn't want to go along with Caiaphas, who was trying to help him. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that Jesus knew what they were about and where they were taking him, and he just didn't want to get into it with them. It was an exercise in futility. But then the high priest asks him this, and he asks him a question that is loaded. He says, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Now, first off, there's no crime in claiming to be the Messiah. That half's okay. Lots of people thought they were the Messiah. But when he says the Son of the Blessed One, it's an interesting word. It's in the notes. It's just an interesting Greek word. It was a name that the Jews used to refer to God. They had lots of names they referred to God by because they didn't want to say his name. They didn't want to say the name of God. They wanted to avoid speaking his name at any time, and so this was not his name, so they used it as a name because it's not a name that was named as one of his names. Does that make sense? And so they called him the Blessed One. Jesus had spoken of himself as the Son of the Father. And we all know that that was completely wrong. Nobody did that. You'd say our Father, but I'd never say my Father. And so he's pushing Jesus to try to get him to do something that will make the whole of the Jewish population mad enough to say the Romans do need to kill this guy. That's what this thing is about. Are you the Messiah? If he says, I am, well, if he says I'm the Messiah, that's not a problem. But then if he says the Son of the Blessed One, this could be a problem. Why does he ask that question? Because that's what he'd kind of heard in the other questions, the other accusations of Jesus. Now, we don't know if Caiaphas had ever heard Jesus talk. We don't know if he had anything to do with him. But what we do know is that people were talking about him. And if he'd never heard him talk, this is the stuff that he'd been hearing Jesus had been saying. That he was claiming to be the Son of God in certain ways. He was saying, my Father. Anytime he says my Father, and he says it all the time. Or he says, I was sent by my Father. He says things like that. And I have come in the name of him. If you've seen the Father, you've seen me. He said things plenty that probably got back to Caiaphas in different ways. So what happens here when he asks Jesus this? And you can see him, you could see his look on his face. He's just ready to go after Jesus here. And then Jesus says this. Can you put the next? He goes, now, the big issue that all the scholars talk about in the book of Mark is the messianic secret. Have you heard me say the messianic secret before? And that everything's about Jesus hiding his identity from everybody, and Jesus telling people not to talk about him, and telling people not to say who he is, and keep that to yourself, and that kind of thing. And this is the gospel of the messianic secret. If that's true, which I'm not a proponent of, but if that's true, the messianic secret is now out of the bottle. He says, I am. Now that, you guys probably all, this is one of the few Greek phrases that almost everybody knows. It's ego eimi. When Moses was in the wilderness, and God came to him in a burning bush and told him that he was supposed to go free the Jews from slavery in Egypt. And Moses says, who do I tell them sent me? The first words out of God's mouth in the Greek, not in Hebrew, but in the Greek, are ego eimi. I am. Or I am who I say that I, or I am, I am. It's very hard to translate. But it's just essentially means I exist always. And, oh yeah, there's the burning bush. Let's see if I didn't know God was in the burning bush. Let's just say, Jesus saying, I am, in the way that he said it when they asked if he was the Messiah, the son of, he could have just said yes. Or he could have said, there's lots of things he could have said, but he quotes God. He uses the name of God to start his answer. Now this would have been enough to get Caiaphas to do a bit of tearing of his robe. But since the gloves are off and the truth is coming out into the open, Jesus is not done. And he's not done in a way that is just really over the top. He says, and you, by the way, you here is plural. So he's no longer just speaking to the high priest, okay? You will see the Son of Man. Now, that's the name that Jesus has used for himself all along. Comes right out of Daniel, and that passage in Daniel says that I saw someone like the Son of Man. Oh, great. Is this guy on it or what? And my vision continued that night. I saw someone like a Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient One and was led into his presence. He was given authority, honor, and sovereignty over all the nations of the world, so that people of every race and nation and language would obey him. His rule is eternal. It will never end. His kingdom will never be destroyed. Now, let's just say the Jews had a really high opinion of the Son of Man. Okay? Look at this. He goes right up to the throne of God, and God gives him what? Power or authority, honor, and sovereignty over all the nations of the world. This pair of verses is like, it's the lodestone of hope for the Jews on the coming of the Messiah. This is what's going to happen, okay? They have been leaning into this for 400 years. And Jesus chooses the name Son of Man to call himself. And it's an odd phrase. I think I preached a sermon on it one time, but it's an odd thing. This says like a Son of Man. Jesus does not say, can you put back up the text where Jesus speaks? He says, and you, I don't know that he did that, but will see the Son of Man. And everybody knows he's been referring to himself as that, and they're all probably thinking he's crazy. But the Son of Man, referring to himself, and then he says, seated in the place of power at God's right hand. Okay, now, first off, the right hand seat is the top place of authority. The king only can tell people to sit there, but if you sit there, your authority is just slightly below the king. You are the second most powerful person. You are there because you belong with, this is a thing. Together, this is where the authority and power is. And he says, you will see the Son of Man. Now he's talking Daniel language, and he's also saying, seated. What happened? In that vision, the Son of Man, what? Comes to God, and he gives all this. And Jesus takes it further. I get to sit at the right hand, in the place of power at God's right. He doesn't mince any words whatsoever. He is saying exactly who he is. Are you the Messiah? Ego eimi, I am. I'm using God's name to answer you. And I'm also telling you that, now this is an interesting thing. You will see. Now, some scholars say he's not talking literally. He's not talking literally. He's just saying that that they just need to recognize this. You'll see that he's the person who can. And other people go, no, this is probably going to happen someday. That you will see this happen. Every position on what's going to happen or what this prophecy is a little different, like when it happens or but it doesn't really matter how it's going to work itself out. What Jesus has made a claim to is that of everybody who's ever lived, everybody who will ever live, everybody who has ever been in power, everybody is all subservient to two things. One, the God of the universe, and the Son of Man. And Jesus has made that claim. That's a pretty powerful claim. He's done messing around. And then he says, and coming, and it's not on, it's with. Coming with the clouds of heaven. A lot of futurists have taken this to mean that Jesus will come down on a cloud. That he's sitting on a cloud. I'm sure there's a painting of that somewhere. But you've heard me say it. When you see the clouds of heaven, it does not mean coming down. It always means coming at you. If down is in it, it means if it says coming down on the clouds or with the clouds, it means from a high place. Okay? And it always means the dust that chariots and horses kick up when the army is coming. Now, in their world, if you're in Jerusalem and you're up at this high hill, because Jerusalem, the temple's on a high place, and you look out into the distance and you see a large cloud of dust kicking up on its way towards you, you know something's coming. You know something's coming. And what Jesus is saying is, not only are you going to see that I'm seated in the right hand of power, but I'm also going to come with the army of heaven. And we are going to take names. Because they're not coming because they're having a party in Jerusalem. They're coming because they're taking over. Now, he's talking to the high priest and his high-level authorities. And he's just threatened them with really strong threat. It's a really strong threat. He's like, this is what's coming. Yes, I'm the Messiah. Yes, I am the Son of the Blessed One. And you're going to see it. You're all going to see it. And you're going to see that I'm the one who gets power, and I'm the one who's going to bring what? Judgment on you with the armies of heaven. Now, think about that for a minute. The Jews think of heaven, the space where God is, and his angels as being what? The protectorates of the Jewish nation. They're always thinking about that in those terms. And yet he's saying, no, the armies of heaven are going to come after you. That's just big. This is huge. Now, is it blasphemy? only if by what Jesus says he's implying they need to worship him. Does that make sense? If by what he's saying I deserve worship from you. Because if he says you need to worship me, then in their mind, any man who says he should be worshiped is blaspheming. But he never says that. He never says it. There's an implication there, and we, post-Jesus, we all know that when he said, tear down this temple and in 3 days I'll rebuild, he's talking about his body. We also know that when he's talking about 3 days, he's going to rise from the dead and that he's going to create a different, we know this stuff. They don't know that stuff. When he says this, we don't know exactly what he's saying in terms of when this will happen, but we all know that he is what? God's son. He is the Son of the Blessed One. He is the Messiah. He is the one who gets to sit at God's right hand. He is the one who comes in judgment. We know that. To them, this would be... Now, here's the bottom line. If they had not had a deep sense that this guy needed to be killed, they'd have all looked at each other and said, this is the craziest nut we've run into in a long time. This is the rantings of a lunatic. We just need to put him outside of the city gates. We just need to get him out of the way because he's crazy. I mean, what do we do when people claim to be God? What do we do when people say that they have the power of God and God told them to come and bring judgment on everybody? Did you guys ever see the guy that used to whistle down on the circle? He had a sign in front of him as the end is near, and he just stood there like this and whistled. I used to try to get him to talk to me, but I couldn't speak whistle. But he was all about that the world was about to, that God was coming, and that he was the messenger. His signs kind of gave you a bit of a... I used to do all the flowers for everything in the mile square. Did I tell you that ever downtown? And the circle was part of it. I had to keep all the flowers. And this guy was always on the circle down there whistling with the end is near and that kind of stuff. And I never once thought, we need to kill this guy. I thought, they need to take him someplace where he won't hurt himself. And that would have been the normal response to Jesus. But they have other issues that they want to take care of here. And you need a break. I've been talking for 45 minutes, guys. Can you imagine if a preacher on the weekend preached that long? I'm so glad we keep it to 30. I'm so glad there's a clock in it. Did you know there's a clock in the back and it counts down and the color of the clock changes when you go over? Yeah. I like that better than what they used to do, which was I'd finish and I'd feel really good about having brought the word to the people, and then Daryl Kripe would walk right up to me and go, you need to at least lose 5 minutes. He'd say it just like that. You need to lose 5 minutes. God bless you too. Okay, let's take 5 minutes. that slide. You can put that on.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, it's on my end, I can actually.
Okay, this slide is for Jeff. He does this every Wednesday. Man, you go from here to 7 o'clock on Wednesday morning here. That's a rough go, Jeff. But it's a time to read the scripture together and talk about it. It's a good thing. It's a really good thing. Yeah.
Which I can't say because
I was going to say, back when it said that Jesus was, or he said that, aren't you going to answer? Don't you have anything to say for yourself? Our text says, but Jesus was silent and he made no reply. The Greek is interesting there. It goes, but he was silent. And then it says, answered not nothing. And in English, double negatives always make it positive. Like we have to be mathematical in our language. 2 negatives make a positive, you know. But in Greek and Aramaic, double negatives accentuate whatever the subject is. And so what Mark is doing is he's not just saying that Jesus didn't answer. He's saying somehow it's a silence that's even greater. His not saying anything is an even greater silence than we can even think about, because he said nothing. Double thing. And you know what it is. Anytime something is said twice in the same way, you need to be in a different way. You need to pay close attention. There's something profoundly important about Jesus' silence. And it's got something to do with his, and just to get devotional for 30 seconds, taking on the sin that he did not commit that was committed by the rest of us. That if he had stood up for himself in the moment, he would have left that space where he was taking on the guilt of others. And in his silence has something to do with us. And I just think that's really profound. And as we go into Easter, we need to think about that. Now, when he's asked about his identity, he speaks up, because it's time to be blunt about it. If for no other reason, then there may be somebody in the semicircle who's making a judgment of him who might catch the vision. But he doesn't want them to go ahead with what they're about to do and not know who they are dealing with. They are dealing with the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One. And that is an equal weight on our shoulders when we think about his silence on our behalf. Who is it that was being silent? But when they heard Jesus say these things, it says, the high priest tore his clothing to show his horror and said, now, Caiaphas needs a guilty verdict here, guys. He needs a guilty verdict. And so he's, I think, tearing his clothes. This is Tim Ayer's thought on this, pushed groupthink. If the high priest is going to rip his clothes, then we ought to all get into the mess here. This is a highly tension-filled moment. Jesus has said something unimaginable, and rather than all of them going, this guy's nuts, or going, maybe we ought to listen to him some more, the high priest rips his clothes to let everybody know that we got a problem here that we can take care of by killing him. And I think I talked about this last time. It's not his fancy robes. It's his tunic, probably the thing that he wears daily, or the thing that he wears under his robes. Oh, I told you last week, didn't I, that he couldn't wear his fancy robes unless the Romans said he could? Yeah, let's think about that. No, Judge, you can't wear your robes except if I tell you you can. Can you imagine how under the thumb they must have felt? Anyway. He's done with witnesses. It's been a waste of time. And he thinks that Jesus' own words have convicted him of a capital crime of blasphemy. And Caiaphas, though, he can't declare Jesus guilty on his own. He doesn't have that power. That's why he says, I think his horror is a little bit put on. Can I just say that? I think that I can remember you, Dad, responding a little bit over the top when I'd done something. You just needed to put a little emphasis on it so that I could know that I didn't need to do that anymore. I remember some of that. But the high priest tore his clothing and he says, why do we need other witnesses? You have all heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict? Because he can't do anything about it. And the truth is, none of them can do anything about it. But they can convict him. And what they've got him for is claiming something that they think is worthy of death. Now, I don't know that, I suppose if he's lying, then maybe so in their minds, but if he's telling the truth, they maybe ought to back up a little bit. But no, they have a unanimous decision that Jesus has crossed into blasphemy. Now, blasphemy is is clearly defined, though they changed it over time. They'd say this was blasphemy or this was, but it didn't really matter. Only the Roman procurator could bring about the death of a convicted criminal, and they didn't really want to put to death somebody because he'd broken some arcane Jewish law about how you refer to God. They don't care about that. This is ridiculous. What, you want to put this guy to death because of that? That would be their normal position. And they needed to come in to Pilate with so much fervor, and everybody worked up at such a level that Pilate's going to go, okay, all right, I'll put him to death if that's what you all need. Is this going to save us a riot if I don't? If I kill him, is it going to save us from having a riot? And are we going to have one if I don't kill him? What's the problem here? And that's what this is what this accusation is. This accusation is because, Pilate would probably have seen an accusation that Jesus was going to tear the temple down and rebuild it in 3 days as no. This is like one of the 7 wonders of the world. It's a monstrous building. He doesn't have like 600,000 followers with sledgehammers. It's like, no, we're not going to worry about that. But then you see their real inner, I guess the word would be character. This is guilty, they all cried, he deserves to die. Because he said he was what? Son of God. And then we get this terrible sentence. It says, then some of them began to spit at him. And they blindfolded him. And they beat him with their fists. And prophesied to us, they jeered. Now this is a clear statement by these guys that they have no concern about the honor of this man. Just so you know, it was against the law to do this to anybody, a convicted criminal. You weren't allowed to do any of this stuff on them. Spitting on people has always been, it's a bad, in our culture, it's not a good thing when somebody spits on you. And it was a terrible thing in their culture. It says that they were blindfolding him. And the purpose of this is to make fun of him as a prophet. Because if they blindfold him and then they hit him and say, tell us who hit you. If you're a prophet, you should be able to know this. This is just pure, I can't even think of the right word. They are just done with Jesus, and They don't hold him, they give him no honor as a human being at all. They don't think of him as anything other than some scum that they need to get rid of. And they can do anything they want to him. They, together as a group, do worse to him than anyone would have done to him singularly, because they would have second thoughts if they were the only one doing it. But the groupthink takes over, and they start, can you imagine, this is always true. People in groups do more horrible things to someone than individuals. And what they're doing to Jesus, we read this and we know the story. But just think about it. They've been spitting on him, and then they bring out a blindfold, something to blindfold him, and then they just start punching him and making fun of him and saying, "Tell us who hit you, Mr. Prophet. Tell us who hit you." And the last sentence says that, and then the guards led him away. Is that on there, Jeff? Isn't there another line after that? Is that the end of it? It says, and the guards slapped him as they took him away, it says. The guards slapped him as they took him away. Now, the guards are the same people who went to arrest him. And so they haven't done anything like this to him. They've dragged him off violently and been very rough with him. And they brought him to the most holy place they could bring him. That would be before the high priest, other than in the temple itself, in the heart of the temple. And yet they don't feel any compulsion whatsoever to treat him as a human being. He's worthless, and he deserves to die. And the guards then sits as they slapped him, as they took him away. We should stop here. It only gets worse. But for me, it's just been really powerful for me to think about what this actually is that's happening to Jesus. And they're just getting started. And why are they doing this? Because his presence is a threat to their power. His presence is a threat to their authority. His presence is a threat to their sovereignty. All the things that the Son of Man was said to be given by God himself. And there's a lot of criticism, there has been over the centuries, that the Jews killed Jesus. Well, the Romans killed Jesus. But a very small handful of Jews wanted Jesus killed. A very, very small handful. And those men wanted him killed because they were a small group of people who had all power and authority in that community. Even though they were answering to the Romans, they were still the ones that had power. The Jews did not kill Jesus. It's unfortunate that John uses the term the Jews to speak of the leadership. And most people never took the time to find out that that phrase meant something specific about leadership. But this small group of Jews, Jewish leaders, and some of them didn't even agree with it, but they still were the ones that wanted him killed. And it all has to do with their own personal place and power. I always have to stop myself and go, what would I have done if I was one of them? I don't know. If I'd only heard about Jesus or only seen him in the temple and everything he said offended me because it was cut me to the bone that he was right about something, and then I then I get an opportunity to go after him. I don't know. This is a sacred time of the year. It's just this. I just hope that together we can take. We know the end of the story. We know the glorious moment of resurrection. And we know the eternal place of Jesus as the one who is the power and authority, the sovereign one who has brought man and heaven together. But the process of getting him there, I just don't want us to ever think that, oh, Jesus just had to go through like 12 hours of roughness to get to this. No, this is a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing. And as I said, they're just getting started. Now, of course, we got to have Peter deny that he knows Jesus before we can get to the rest of the story, but we'll get to that next week. Now, remember, next week we're in that room. And I know it's not appropriately put together, but we'll figure it out for 1 week, okay? We'll do it. So next week we'll go back to Peter. Thank you. And I'll see you next week.